Started here. My name is Ken Jones. I teach in the history department. I teach recent U.S. history. And I'm going to go sit down now because I come back in the second act. So I will let Peggy introduce herself and we will move forward.
Doing a dog and pony show. Thank you all for coming. I don't know how many other events you've gone to this week. I wish I had gone to more myself, or this weekend today. I am going to be talking about an event from 1970 in some detail. I think one of the things I've learned from working in the archives about things like this is the importance of the press, because newspaper clippings go a long way toward telling a good story. One hopes that they're accurate, but one knows that they aren't always, nor are our own publications here always completely accurate. But those are the written record, and between that and nowadays other forms of communication that I can archive, it gives us more information to pass down to posterity. I am the archivist for St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. For those of you who don't know, there's also two other archives on our two campuses, one for the monastery at St. Ben's and one for the Abbey here at St. John's. And I've been doing this, I'm in my 10 years, I'm in my 11th year of doing this. I love what I do, and I love finding out things like this that I can explain to various audiences. So welcome, and I hope you're interested in learning about this. I wasn't there when this happened. I gathered evidence from those mostly written sources and some people that I was able to talk to. Since this is being taped, I'm hoping that maybe someday the people that were actually there and involved in this incident, notably the students themselves, might have occasion to watch it, and I would love to get their personal recollections and their comments orally or in written form to add to the archive sometime. I would love to have their point of view. And just a plug, if you haven't been over to the Elkwin Library since it reopened on Monday, come on over and check out the new archives in the basement. The dungeon doesn't look like a dungeon anymore. It's a great facility now. Okay, 1968. Before this, some of the students at St. John's were starting to recognize their white privilege, shall we say. And there was a group that actually went away to a workshop, two white students and one Asian American student, and they wrote about it in this December article in the 1968 Record, the student newspaper, all of which are online, by the way. Plug for the archives. These are the days when there was consciousness raising going on in our society, I would say. Race relations were an issue, and white privilege. Interpersonal relationships were being better understood. Human relations classes. The book I'm Okay, You're Okay was published in 1969. So it was noted in the record that the students went to this workshop. In the same issue of the record, on the same page, there was a note about black students forming a union, so to speak, an organization that in the newspaper here was referenced as the Organization for Afro-Associated Students, or OAAS. It actually was referred to nowhere else as Afro-Associated Students. It became African-American students or Afro-American students in other resources. So there's one case where, did the record just have the wrong word in there? Don't know for sure. Maybe they changed their name. Here's a few students that were the officers and were pictured as such in the 1970 yearbook. In the fall of 1968, there were about 25 blacks on this SJU campus, and so they founded this organization to develop black unity and promote black culture in the community. The following spring, they requested monetary support to establish a black student cultural center. And here are some clippings from the meetings of what was called the Black Advisory Council, and it had some familiar names in it. John Eisenschenk was the dean of the SOT. Dr. Ferry and Dr. Henry were in the government department. Dr. Hughes chaired the chemistry department. John Lang was the academic vice president. Aidan McCall, Father Aidan McCall, who was black, was the dean of students. And There's student names are most of the rest of those listed there. So they were the council, and they met, and discussion talked about a Black Cultural Center, and something had been evidently suggested that Frank House could house such a thing, and Father Aiden disagreed with that. Frank House wasn't a possibility, and neither is the basement of Bennett. So those were talked about as options for places. Father Hillary had a proposal about putting them down in what was then called the Day Student Lounge, which was in Mary Hall, First Mary, down where the Career Center is now. So that was put forth as a possibility in the Day Student Lounge, and they got kind of serious about this. They sort of agreed that they would investigate that as a possibility, and one of the Black students, Jerome Barney, would present the Dean of Students with sketches and a list of furnishings, etc. So this was in '69, April '69, so they were going to start this Black Cultural Center. Here we have a bit about that from a paper that a student wrote on the history of the Black Student Union. Father Vincent, who was one of my predecessors in the archives, often had his students write papers on the history of St. John's, and he saved them in the archives, so they've become valuable sources for me in a number of ways. And if any other history profs want to do that, there's lots more topics that could be researched in the archives. So here it just mentions that they had formed this union, and that the university gave them 2 small rooms in the basement of the Abbey Church, aka the basement of the Great Hall, to use as a Black Cultural Center. And then later on, there's this picture of it from, I believe, from the record. It's located in the quadrangle right around the corner from the SJU bookstore, which I take it is kind of where IT Services is now. But later on, they actually had a space in the basement of the auditorium. So any of you I don't see too many of you, aside from the neighbors, who are here long enough ago to remember those places, but that latter one was confirmed by my brother, who was actually one of those day students who got displaced, or was going to be displaced. He said, yeah, I remember the Black students had this really nice lounge, and the day students had this hole in the wall over in the basement of Mary Hall. Anyway, so here's April '69, a memo, handwritten memo from Don Conway, who was then the vice president of development for St. John's, who expressed concerns about were the fundraisers for St. John's supposed to raise money to have this Black Cultural Center, and how much was needed, and is that supposed to be a different priority compared to trying to get a student union for all the students, or a new gym? So this was in the days before the Palestra. Several years before the Palestra, almost a dozen years before the Palestra. So there was concern about that. The cost could easily exceed $5,000 to $6,000. Other students might protest about their lounges by comparison, and so they needed to talk about that. The civil rights movement was grabbing headlines and advocates across the country at this time, and by 1970, 2 years after the OOAS was founded, the number of Blacks on campus had increased to over 70. And this picture was from the 1970 yearbook showing the membership, or at least the officers, of the OAAS. And this picture, I believe, is taken in Rat Hall, so I don't know if they had a facility in Rat Hall at that time. Okay, here's an issue of the St. John's Alumni Magazine in the fall of 1970, which was about, the cover article was about the Center for Study of Local Government, which Ed Henry ran here, but the issue also had articles on minorities in business, Native American students, of which there were very few here, a big grant that they got for tutorials, and the 5 departments that are now joint were biology, music, math, communication, and theater, and art. So those were the initial ones that actually went joint, and that was still a big deal back in 1970, even though the classes were more joint than they had been. Along with that, the focus on minorities for this particular issue, there was also an article about Bill Cofell, who happens to be here, taking education students down to Minneapolis to experience a school that had a mix of races, and how important it was for our education students to do that. His once-a-week program was a way of increasing contact between colleges and elementary schools and the community to improve race relations in the classroom. So even at that point, it was recognized that our students needed more exposure than they were getting by being students here, especially our education students who would have to deal with multiracial classrooms when they left. At least hopefully they would. So this was the article in that issue on international students on campus. And it mentioned on page 17 that this year there were 77 international students at St. John's from 16 foreign countries. And that was 50% higher than it had been the year before, according to Father Tom Thole, who was the international student advisor at St. John's. Elsewhere in the article, it says there were 77 international students from 14 foreign countries, so I'm not sure which one was right, but there were no authors listed on the article, so one had 14 and one had 16. One of them here is pictured, Rich Moore, who was a senior at that time, and so he was quoted extensively in this article. And one of the things he said is that he and others want to bring authors, musicians, and scholars to campus. They feel the university's sponsored lecture and convocation series ignored Black expression. And also the Black Student Center is a haven to reinforce Black values, display artistic and creative forces, and trying to destroy some of the common stereotypes we feel that whites have of Blacks. Another student featured is Homer Brown. He was a sophomore from St. Louis, and he emphasized that they wanted to promote Blackness not as a color, but as an idea and an uplifting force. He wants to have liberating sessions with administrators, faculty members, coaches, etc., at the Black Student Center to draw whites to the center to try to understand Black viewpoints. In general, I think we've done enough to try to understand the white point of view these past 200 years. It's their turn now. It's one of his quotes. So back to this this issue that came out in the fall of 1970. In the small print on this verso of the title page was this little piece that says, this issue was prepared and set in type 2 weeks before the occupation of the president's office. And so it grew out of frustrations similar to those described by the Black students in this article. So I thought that was very interesting. You know, they had this article ready to go about minority students and talking about them all, and then the incident of the occupation took place. So the students submitted this proposition concerning Black survival. It's actually on legal paper, and it's about 6 pages long, typed up with somewhat flowery language. And as Father Coleman related it later in the letter, he said, the student Russell Larkin made an appointment with him for November 11th, and he came accompanied by a bunch of other students, and they read this proposition concerning Black survival out loud to Father Coleman. And when he asked for an opportunity to reply, they didn't let him. They just left the room. So that was November 11th, which was a Wednesday. So this was dated the 11th. So they laid out 2 demands. The first one was $10,000 for the purpose of promoting successfully culture and unity among people of African descent on the twin campuses, socially and politically. And I looked it up just out of curiosity. $10,000 in those days would be about $62,000 nowadays. So it was not a small amount of money for people in the development office to have to raise, or other things. Tuition was, I should have looked that up, but even when I was a student, it was only $1,800, so it was still pretty low compared to today. And the second demand was an ongoing budget to purchase educational materials and supplies for the center to enable them to sponsor events to contribute something to the westernized atmosphere of the SJU and CSB community. They proposed to spend it on education materials, books, magazines, newspapers, films, records, etc., speakers, renovation materials here, which meant relics, pictures, statues, bookcases, tables, social endeavors to bring Black entertainers and dancers here, Black programs, and miscellaneous materials like a film projector and a tape recorder and a typewriter. They requested a response by noon on Monday. So this was Wednesday. They wanted a response by noon on Monday. And if it's going to be negative, the only step they wanted was that they would reply to it in writing. Other conditions were that it was St. John's had to share this with St. Ben's. It was to apply to both campuses. We demand the financial aid to be submitted to the organization directly, officially, and immediately by noon on Monday. The administration shouldn't attempt to compromise. That won't be accepted under any circumstance. And it's impossible to accept one demand and reject the other. The two are together and had to be accepted collectively. Other place in the document, they said, since the St. Ben St. John's don't offer a Black Studies program geared to us, and Black, proud, and determined to be free people, we feel that we should take responsibility to educate ourselves in the Black Cultural Center. We feel that our organization must be considered as a separate academic department of the two institutions. It's hard to get an academic department approved even today, so that was a pretty big step. And they emphasized their survival. We will not sit here and submit. We will not sit here and conform or be controlled. We know what we want. We're fighting for our survival. We will not accept a slice of bread because we want the loaf, given the references to Johnny Bread and so on. I thought it was pretty clever of them. Okay, so the President's Administrative Council met 2 days later on Friday the 13th, and it consisted of the people that are named here. Father Coleman was the president. Father Don Conway was, I mentioned him already. Father Alfred taught English. I could go through the list, but those of you who've been around here long enough will recognize those names. They were, some of the important decision makers, plus some student representatives. So Robert Flannery, there was a representative from the SOT, and Dave Van Lanschut. The only one in the group that was actually Black would have been Father Aidan McCall, who was admittedly quite used to being the only Black in various milieus on campus. And they had a 3-point agenda. The proposal and the Black occupation were also there. So they had advance notice about this. So on to the first point, Father Coleman began by saying they had formulated an answer to the document and would sign a signed letter by Father Coleman would be sent out to every Black student on campus. They thought the letter was a good strategy. There were wondered, I think it was Joe Ferry who said, are a few Blacks forcing division among all of them? And should the Bahamians and the Africans both be included, or was this the Afro-American students, the Black students who were putting forth the proposal, and were the administrators going to try to divide and conquer? Was that a wise move? Someone else, I think it was Father Florian, downplayed it, and he mentioned that he feared white reaction among the other students. Father Aidan said, we're not going to get out of the problem because it's obvious this institution is going to have to make some changes in order to meet the demands of the students that it brings here. St. John's has not faced up to the problem, and this will be an opportunity to do so. So 3 cheers for Father Aidan. He was looking at it very positively as a way to advocate for some change. The third item on the agenda was then the Black occupation. So Father Coleman informed the council that a group of Blacks planned to occupy his office with food and primitive weapons on Monday. So he knew that this was coming. It wasn't a surprise. He will leave the office open, but he would not be there. Actually, as it happened, he was going to the funeral for Dave Dernberger's first wife, the funeral was that Monday. The personnel files would be placed in the vault. And then Dr. Henry and Dr. Ferry suggested things here. They were starting to get nervous and, should we get the district court judge involved? They would get injunctions for them. Coleman would prepare the injunctions and notify the district court judge and serve the injunctions to the protesters. The upshot of it was that Father Coleman would respond to the Black students' box number, acknowledging that they had received the communication, but were puzzled over the intent and the authorship, because they didn't put their names on it. There was a whole bunch of students, but it didn't actually have their names. They hadn't signed it. So that motion was seconded and passed among this group. Here's a carbon of the letter. And among other things, it says, I'm replying to the proposition which was presented to me. I presented it to the Administrative Council and have considered it. They unanimously state that we can't consider the proposition if it's not signed, and we ask that signatures be subscribed to this petition. Since it's not signed, there is no way in which to know how many students are represented or the dimension of the specific requests. So they're kind of taking the easy way out, the bureaucratic way out of saying, well, we can't do anything because it's not signed. But you sign it, then we'll talk about it some more. Well, on Monday at 2:45 p.m., about 20 black students entered the office of the president carrying food supplies and boards to barricade themselves in. The secretary was asked to leave the office. Coleman was away attending a funeral. I happen to know that the secretary, who's still with us, she was asked to leave, but she didn't. She said, I don't know what you guys are up to, but I have work to do. I'm going to stay here. And Brother Elmer, who called her Lady Elaine, it was Elaine Vogel. Elaine told me that Father Elmer came and he was all concerned because she was barricaded in there with the students and they should let her out, let Lady Elaine out. And Elaine said, don't worry about it, Elmer. I'm just getting my work done. And so she worked until 4:30 and then she left. So the legal counsel and the police were summoned. Attempts were made to get them to leave, and 9 of them refused. And so the legal injunction was read out loud. You can see the student peeking out of the transom window above the door. The court order was issued and read by the bull. You can see the bullhorn there, and they slipped it under the door. So this picture was from the St. Cloud Times, as is this article, which of course was the front page of the St. Cloud Times the next day. Big deal, students. We didn't have any blacks in St. Cloud to speak of, and to have the black students out at St. John's sitting in. This was a day when lots of people had sit-ins, but still it was a big deal to have happened here and raised some consciousness in what is too often still called white cloud. So the 9 students left the room, and then they gave them 10 more minutes to think about it, and then they locked their arms in a circle and refused to leave. So 9 students were arrested on contempt charges and went to jail for the night. And they made a point to say that the arresting officers removed their guns and nightsticks and applied no apparent force in removing the students. So it was a peaceful demonstration. It made the front page of the Minneapolis Trib the next day, too. Black sit-in ended at St. John's with this picture of a black student in front of Father Coleman. I wish I had that picture in the archives. And then there was this nice article in the Minneapolis Star asking why. Blacks seize St. John's office, why? And then the quote in large letters, if we wait any longer, we will begin to die out. Other things they said was there's a certain commitment made by black students, and there were 9 students who kept the commitment. This is according to Leroy Smith, who was pictured earlier. He said the demands and the occupation were fueled by a fear that if we wait any longer, we will gradually begin to die out. And a St. Ben student named Shirley Nkrumah Sanders, we wanted to tell the colleges to give us our lives back. And last, Charles Harvey, an 18-year-old from St. Louis, we wanted to show that we really want to survive. We were only talking about surviving. And then it mentions the 2 campuses have a combined enrollment of 2,200 students, and 121 of them are black. Again, the numbers are difficult to relate, and actually Ken's going to deal with that a little bit. So why? Thoughts of survival were also expressed by Father Barry, sipping a glass of Scotch whiskey in his 100-year-old office. He said, the Order of Benedict has been around for 14 centuries, and we intend to keep going. No surprise there. And he said a campus disciplinary board would withhold consideration until the student's court case was settled, which was also the case at St. Ben's. So then the St. Cloud Times the next day, Father Barry appeals for calm as 9 black students returned to class. They got out of jail, came back, and went back to their classes. He had written a general letter and asked them to be received back with true Christian charity and understanding. But the defendants denied being in need of either. Quote, they act as if we had committed some sort of crime. They say, follow your conscience, and then when we do, they say, oh, why did you do that? So, misunderstandings. Then on the afternoon and evening of November 24th, the day before they were going to be appearing in court, the Executive Governing Board of St. John's met to consider how to respond. And they had 2 motions. It was moved and seconded that the Executive Board go on record as being opposed to acceding to the demands as presented to Father Coleman. And it was moved and seconded that they recognize that certain needs exist for which funds are not now available. It urged Dr. Zerda over at St. Ben's, the president there, and Father Coleman to raise funds for specific purposes, including legitimate needs of the black community, and to consult with appropriate groups, including members of the black community in such needs. So things were moving forward, so to speak. Okay, here's the St. Cloud Times article from the court appearance. So they had taken over the office. They appeared in court before Judge Paul Hoffman on November 25th. He told them, "It's difficult, if not completely impossible, for me to understand the full extent of your problems, stresses, and strains. So I decided to reduce the term of their sentences," basically. So he was a very understanding judge. At the end of the hearing, then, he asked the court reporter to allow some off-the-record discussion. So in other words, he told her, "Don't take notes on this." He wanted to enter into a dialogue with the students. So he spent a considerable amount of time chatting with the students to better understand their situation. So I actually have, years ago, came across something related to this and mentioned it with Sister Emmanuel, who was working in the St. Ben's archives at the time. And I do remember quite clearly her saying how much she respected the judge for the way that he handled that situation and the way that he addressed and handled the students. She had a lot of respect for him for that. So then afterwards, on December 7th, the all-college board met. These are the people who, according to the J-Book, were empowered to take necessary action when the behavior of a student is unacceptable to the community. They could impose probation, suspension, or dismissal. This is where it gets a little confusing for me, because they decided, on the advice of the judge, against taking any further action against the students. The punishment imposed by the court is more severe than any punishment this board could impose. I didn't quite understand that, because they didn't really get much of a punishment except to have gone through the experience and to be on probation, so to speak, for a while. But they didn't get expelled. They didn't get any consequences for their academics here. Then on the 18th of December, so about a month later, the Administrative Council unanimously approved this statement. "Disruption of the normal functioning will not be tolerated. If, after having been officially warned, disruptors persist, the assistance of the civil authorities may be invoked." So in other words, they were taking this as an occasion to set up a policy to deal with any future such activities. Over at St. Ben's, Stan Adzurda's comments in an issue of this community newsletter, "Any disruption of the St. Ben's campus by students will be met with legal action, and the students will be suspended from the college." So St. Ben's came forth with a policy of our own. But Stan went on to say, he had this long letter to the community, "Our strength as a community has been tested and enhanced by the events of the past 2 weeks. We should not retreat into a comfortable ghetto made up of the compatible white Catholics of North European origin." He said that if we seek to be honest, open, prayerful, and trusting, despite everything, we will have unity. And I just threw this into the Black Student Union came up with their own graphic for their logo here, which I thought was pretty neat. And then a few closing quotes here. They, when asked, the students said they wanted to remain at the schools and help prepare the groundwork for our brothers and sisters who will be coming up. People might ask, "If you hate it, why don't you leave?" I would say to them that if I did that, I would have to pack up and leave America, because America is Western culture, and the only way is to stay here and face it. So there was lots of work left to be done, but the groundwork had been laid for the progress that we would all make in the years to come, and which I'm sure many of us here would say we still need to do. Okay, Ken, over to you for explanations.
Maybe.
I'll get your PowerPoint up here. There you go.
She's not going anywhere. Hang on to your questions for her, because I'm not answering questions on her part. Okay. My job is, I think, really to do three things. One is to help you think about what's going on in the civil rights movement over this period, because I think we start with a certain image, and by this point things have changed, so I want to convey that. Secondly, there are some other things besides race going on at St. Ben's and St. John's that I think are important in understanding what happens. And thirdly, I want to address the question of why occupy the president's office rather than something else. So we'll get to that. Okay, somewhere here I have a clicker. Okay, we all know this face. This is the face we're celebrating today. What does he stand for? If you had to 2 words, 3 words, 4 words. What would you say? This is the audience participation part. Civil rights. What else besides civil rights? Justice. How achieved? Nonviolence. To what end? Equality, integration, right? Blacks and whites together. Beloved community. That's actually not his, but yes. Okay, in other words, we're going to take this kind of action against African Americans, and we're going to meet it with this, with nonviolent protest. As you well know, he makes a speech in the Washington Monument, or excuse me, the Lincoln Monument in Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, in which he lays out his vision. And at the end of that speech, sorry, I got too many pages here. At the end of that speech, this is what he says. Take a look here. We're going to be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants, Catholics, etc., will be able to join hands and sing in the words, and we will all be free at last. The message that he's promoting here is that we're all going to be free together, and the goal is all of us together, not separation, but all of us together and equal, and we're going to get there through nonviolence, as you know. Now, his efforts are aimed at awakening the conscience of white America so that white Americans will give blacks the rights that they're supposed to have under the Constitution, which have been subverted. And it works to some degree. This is the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the first major Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. And as you can see here in the middle, President Johnson has just signed it, and he's giving a pin to Dr. King. So, the system works, okay? Now, the same day that King made the I Have a Dream speech at Washington, there was another less famous speech. Bonus points for the person who can identify the speaker. You're seeing an older version of him in the news a lot lately. John Lewis, thank you. Okay, those of you who haven't been paying attention, this is the guy who said that he didn't think that Trump's election was legitimate and has been in a Twitter war with the now president. John Lewis was a young activist at that time for a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which I'll talk more about later on. Here's his speech. Actually, this is toned down from what he wanted to say. Sorry, this thing picks up everything. What do you see that's different? See any difference at all? People, I love to talk, and I'll just keep talking. Yeah?
His speech is more violent.
What do you mean by violent?
Like, his anger, he's expressing his anger rather than violence.
Sure. What words in here express that to you?
We will take matters into our own hands.
We will take matters into our own hands. Gorgeous. Think about the other process. You're asking for something. Here he's saying we're going to take power into our own hands. He says we're not going to wait for the president. We're not going to wait for the Justice Department. We're not going to wait for Congress. We're going to create a source of our own power. Okay. Despite that difference, Lewis is going to continue with the let's awaken the white conscience by getting shit beat out of us mode of civil rights activity. This is John Lewis on Bloody Sunday at Selma when he got beaten within an inch of his life. So it may help you understand some of his comments today. This was the reaction to Bloody Sunday. What do you see? How would you define what you see? How do I have a room full of people and nobody is brave enough to say anything? It's simple, people. There's no right answer. What do you see? People marching, okay. What are the people like? I'm sorry, again. Calm, okay. What else? Integrated, yeah. If you look, you got a black guy here, you got two nuns here in the classic habit, another white guy and a black guy here. They're all walking along solemnly, no violence, integrated, black and white together. And guess what happens next? We get another law, and we get another signing. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, probably the most important law that's passed during this period. This time, Martin Luther King, oops, what did I have to do there? Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy don't get center stage. If you remember the last one, they were right behind the president. You can see they're off to the side, but they're still there. I don't think they get a pin on this one. But we get the second major piece of legislation out of this period. Now, you're probably saying, some of you who have some understanding of American history that you remember from high school maybe, that this be nice appeal to white consciences and the government will act and help people all be together kind of approach is not the only thing that's going on at this point in the 1960s. And you're right, okay? This is the Nation of Islam. This is the leader, Elijah Muhammad, there in the front. Elijah Muhammad promotes the idea that we need black separatism, complete black separatism, not integration, because whites are devils and you cannot live with them, you cannot deal with them. We need black self-help, and if we're attacked, we use violence in response. Put Martin Luther King and stand him on his head. Okay? And my guess is most of the room understands that Malcolm X is the most famous speaker for the Nation of Islam. He draws a lot of white attention prior to his assassination in 1965, and even more after his autobiography was published. Not many African Americans were willing to follow them at this point. Lots of white attention, not a lot of black attention, because they understood who had the guns. You're going to follow a guy who says, let's use violence, and you have no way to defend yourself? That's insane. Okay, so you do have this countercurrent to King, but it's not very visible, at least in the black community. But attitudes are changing. I want you to think for a moment about what happens with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and let me explain very quickly. They're founded in 1960 by people who are the age of the students in this room. They wanted to live in the society that they wanted to create. They wanted to live the society that they wanted to create. White and black together in an effort to use nonviolence to bring about an open, integrated society. They talked about themselves as the beloved community. That's where the phrase comes from. They are a beloved community modeling the ideal. This is a group of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee people in 1964. What do you see? Julian Bond, thank you. Those of you who've been here a few years, you know he was here a little bit ago. Julian Bond is this guy right here in the front, okay? Please notice that it's integrated. You got white couple behind here, you've got white here, blacks. SNCC is very much in an integrated mode. Let me tell you a little bit about this guy right here, Bob Zellner. He had been with SNCC for several years. He is married to the woman on the other side of Julian Bond. They met in the movement. Bob was arrested 18 times. He was beaten unconscious a couple of times, and he was almost lynched one time. Pretty committed to this civil rights organization and to this practice. But in 1966, he's going to be kicked out of SNCC. He and the rest of the whites that are still left are going to be kicked out of SNCC because SNCC is now consumed by this idea of black power, this idea that blacks need to be separate in order to make their own way. And I think you need to think about that to understand the kinds of demands that we saw in Peggy's presentation. This is Stokely Carmichael making one of his Black Power speeches. He becomes the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And here's the line from his classic speech. That doesn't sound like nonviolence, does it? That doesn't sound like integration, does it? Martin Luther King for these young people is becoming increasingly irrelevant. I mean, we celebrate King like everybody saw him walking on water for the whole period. And by this point, by 66, he's being, I mean, really derogatory terms being used about him. And they really see him as pretty irrelevant. Okay, so let me move away from the movement, from the civil rights movement for a minute here, and point out that there are also all kinds of challenges to this nonviolent approach going on in the streets. We have urban riots in the North from 65 through 68. The first cause, I think we've pretty much lost now, but look at how depressing the other set is. Those are the same ones that we're looking at now. Exactly the same issues. Not much different in that sense. This is Watts, Los Angeles in 1965. That's not fog, that's smoke from burning buildings. This is a 13-year-old who was killed in Newark in 1967. Watts, there were 34 killed in a week of rioting. Newark, there were 26 killed over 5 days. And in Detroit in 1967, 43 were killed in 5 days. So a massive, every summer disaster in terms of violence. And the largest of the riots took place in April of 1968 after Dr. King was assassinated. Basically, the whole nation went up with violent protests. Just 2 months after Dr. King was assassinated in June of 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated as well. Those of you who don't know Robert Kennedy, he was seen at that time as sort of, I guess maybe the Bernie Sanders of the period, a man who was interested in black rights, the only white in the races that was going to be a champion for that. And he's killed as well. People looked at this and it seemed like people who wanted to use the political system to create change were simply being eliminated and hope is disappearing. All right, enough on that. Let's move to St. Ben's, St. John's. What's happening behind the pine curtain in all this period? It is a period of great ferment, and let me just go through this really, really quickly. New graduation requirements and a new schedule. St. John's students no longer have to sign out to leave campus. Before, if you were going to leave campus, you had to sign in with the prefect and say where you're going and when you're going to be back. So now you can leave without telling an adult. There are protests that year over food contracts, alcohol policy, visitation rules, you name it, we're having a protest about it. We are talking, as Peggy mentioned, co-institutionality, cooperation between the two schools. There's a huge debate, not just with faculty, but with students, St. John's students thinking that St. Ben's is inferior and they don't want this, it will degrade the quality of their degree. And others saying, no, we need to learn from women. So, you know, lots of debate going on over that. Oh my God. Okay? Just to show that this is not just a private college Minnesota thing, my wife went to a public institution in California, and you could not eat unless you were wearing a dress, and just basically the same time. So, you know, it's a national thing. Okay. Student evaluations of teachers and courses. My goodness, students have a voice. Holy moly, the revolution is here. And they're on committees. Whoa. And St. Ben's not only goes for a layperson, but they go for a man, the first male in charge at St. Ben's. The world is coming unglued, and it gets worse the next year. We have the Community Education Project, which involves co-ed housing, not in the same rooms, but living in the same building, and a self-designed curriculum. If you think back to what Peggy said about the black students saying we need to teach ourselves, that's going on in this conversation in 1968-69 before their demands. Their demands are in line with what's happening. Students are saying we want to design our own learning structure. They had a timeout day to reflect on educational reform, on changing curriculum, changing student input on these things. Day when there were no classes and you sat around and talked about this stuff. Abbey allows monks to go back to baptismal names. All of a sudden you don't even know who you're talking to anymore. We have, horrors of horrors, a joint yearbook, St. Ben's and St. John's together. And Peggy showed you the piece on this, which is a really interesting article. If you're interested in this stuff at all, go ask Peggy to see that whole article. It's really, really good. And the organization founded, and new open house rules announced at St. John's, so you could have some more visitation, which is probably the most important thing for 18 and 19-year-old males. And then we have one more here that the people who are sitting up here in the front of the room with me will remember and know. The Firehouse Theater, this is also the period of the counterculture. The Firehouse Theater has nudity in the presentation. There was a huge debate over whether or not it could be on campus. The abbot and the president said no. The students voted yes, and they went and held it anyway, despite the authorities' concern. So we have enormous debates over that. All right. Reflecting on this period, I love this conversation. Everything's been questioned and analyzed. The fact is, people have cared. Power, power. This is the 1969 yearbook written by a white kid. The occupation doesn't come till the next year. So think about this is in the water. This is in the atmosphere. Okay? This is not something that just happens by this handful of black kids on the outside. It's a broader piece than that. Okay, back up just a tad. Peggy gave you some numbers, but I wanted to emphasize how white this place was before. 6 black students, 1 who wasn't from the Bahamas. Outside speakers, all white males, no diversity in outside performers at all. If you were sitting here in 1965, 66, you would have felt, if you're a black person, you would have felt totally out of place. And no minorities in the student council. Okay, a little more color. Peggy did most of this. We can skip that. I like this, that there's more recognition of non-majority people and students. Woody Banks is from Chicago, was elected to the student council. Lou Nixon, also from Chicago, becomes a DJ on the radio station. So they're engaged in the community in that sense. This is the year before the occupation. We're up to 2.5% of the total. And please notice, all of a sudden, they're increasingly from the United States, not from the Bahamas, which brings a whole different attitude, a whole different. And we have all kinds of more visibility going on, so that piece is changing, and we can, okay, let's move on here and ask the question that I wanted to raise, which is, why would you shift from being a student club that's bringing in these outside events, helping plan things? They've got a Black Weekend organization going. They've got some things happening. Why would you move from that to confrontation? Well, one thing I would argue is that numbers matter, that you have to have some kind of critical mass in order to act in a public way. There is an ongoing frustration, as you saw in the materials that Peggy showed you, with the enduring sense that this is a white space. You have the Black Power argument that I've been trying to promote, which is that you don't get anywhere without challenging. You can't have real power if it's a gift. If it's a gift, it can be taken back. If it's power, you own it. So if it's always a handout, then you don't really have anything. It can always be taken away by the person in control. And I would add one more piece to that, and that's why I think I'm supposed to be up here, which is the broader perspective of national events. The national narrative had been that King showed us our faults and we fixed them, but it's clear at the end of the 60s that we haven't done that yet, and there's a real sense that the nation is reversing course. And let me just, the Nixon campaign appeals to Southern whites. Nixon's elected in 68, for those of you for whom recent American history isn't sort of what you breathe. Sorry about that. Nixon administration also tries to stop the Supreme Court from enforcing the 1954 Supreme Court decision, finally in Mississippi. They fail, the Supreme Court goes ahead and does it. But that's 1969, it finally gets done, and the Nixon administration is opposed to it. He also is trying to make the Supreme Court more conservative. They're arresting multiple leaders of the Black Panthers, which is a radical black power group. And Black Panther leader Fred Hampton is murdered in his bedroom in Chicago by the FBI and the Chicago police. And then we have this. That's not bad concrete work on there. Those are bullet holes in a dorm in Jackson State in Mississippi. You had a bunch of students who were standing in these windows looking out at some kind of disturbance on the ground down below. The police decided that they were under attack, turned and fired and killed 2 black students. And I would suggest that this might have been particularly powerful if you were a college student here to say, oh my God, I can be looking out my dorm and somebody decides that I'm dangerous because I'm a black kid and they're going to blow me away. Okay, that's May of 70. Okay, so we're getting close here. December of 70 is, or excuse me, November of 70 is what we're looking for. Students in the OAS at St. John's St. Ben's evidently identified with all of this movement to a more radical position because in October of 1970, they staged a rally for Angela Davis. Now, I'm going to skip the question here and just tell you. Who's Angela Davis? Angela Davis, at this point, was accused of providing guns to help a prisoner escape in which courtroom guards were killed. She is on the run in 1970. She's captured by the FBI on October the 13th, 1970. They staged this rally on October the 31st, 1970. Now, she's going to be acquitted in 1972. So don't think of her as sort of some total crazy. I mean, the courts are going to clear her. But to support her at this point, after her arrest in October of 1970, would have placed you on the far left of the political spectrum. You're going to be seen as part of an extreme black nationalism, extreme attack on authority, an argument that all authority is corrupt, that violence is legitimate. This is a pretty gutsy move, pretty far out move for them to do. I'm sorry, I should have shown you this. Proof the FBI is looking for it. Okay, case closed. Why the president's office? Well, we go back to national events. Partly it's a symbol of power, obviously. Partly you need fewer people to occupy the president's office than you do to close the roads into St. John's, which the anti-war protesters had tried to do. And it's what people at the time did. This is San Francisco State protesters occupying a room in 1968. These are students occupying the president's office at Duke in February of 1969. This is probably the most famous of all of these. This is black students exiting Cornell's administrative offices and Student Rec Center in April of 1969 with guns, as you can see, with ammunition. Their demand was a black cultural center and Africana studies center, so it's the same kinds of demands that we're talking about here. So if you want to get attention, all you got to do is look back over the past few months. You say, oh, well, that's what everybody else is doing, so we can do it as well. And if you don't want to be black, this is also something that Native Americans are doing. This is a Native American group occupying Alcatraz, which was abandoned prison at that time. They're reclaiming native lands by simply going and being there. Okay, so where do we go after the occupation? Peggy gave you the demands and the response. Where are we 5 years later? We've gone from 2.5% down to 1.9% in both campuses, okay? We do have attention to diversity. Angela Davis actually comes here and gives a speech, okay, after she's cleared. And the Native American author, Vine Deloria, comes. Those of you who don't know him, his big book at the time is called Custard Died for Your Sins, which probably gives you a sense of where he's coming from in this kind of thing. To put this in a little broader context, let me show you this. This is also from 1974. The time when we're wrestling with this here, this is Boston. There's a huge fight in Boston and other cities over court-enforced busing to achieve racial equality in public schools. These people are not happy. And this is one of the calmer ones that I could find. Hell no, busing must go. And these people are not singing happy birthday here. So, we're doing this, they're doing that. It is still a very tense time on all of these issues. And let me move us to the end here, or at least as far as I'm going to go. Where are we 10 years later? We are down to 3 black students at St. Ben's and 1.5% of the total. We were at 2.5 before, remember? And St. John's, we're back to 1965, 66. If you're interested, the 25 black students at St. Ben's that make up the rest of that are not interested in any of this kind of stuff. They are largely women in their 30s and 40s from the Bahamas who are trying to finish a degree in education so they can go back and be certified to teach in the Bahamas. They come here for a year and a half, they get their degree, they go home. They don't want to mess with any of this stuff. So reality, this ought to be 3 black students here for St. Ben's and 6 for St. John's. I mean, we have, that whole black power piece is totally gone. Okay, that leaves 20 seconds left according to my watch. Okay, I should shut up and turn this off and let you ask questions. You can ask Peggy questions. Gee.
So is your presentation implying that St. John's and St. Ben's got scared from the student protest and so stopped recruiting black students to our campuses?
No, that's not my take. I don't know enough yet. There's lots more to learn, and Peggy's going to help me do that. But I don't think that that's the situation. We have an interview with Father Don LeMay, who talks, it was in missions at the time, talks about simply more competition for black students as you move forward. And if you have choices, then the kind of line that Peggy used, and I'm blanking on the guy's name, that says, we got to stay here, we got to keep on going, that becomes, I think, less probable if you can go to lots of other places. Why stick it out here? Why not go to a place where you can go into town and get your hair done the way you want it done? Why not go to a place where you can get food that you like? Why not go to a place where you're not followed in the stores? Why be here? This is just too hard a slog here. So I think we lost that way. I also think we probably, and I don't know this yet, but we probably we stopped working as hard to do this because we'd built the American blacks are largely, not entirely, but largely from Chicago or St. Louis. And we had a single connection in St. Louis, as I understand it, some multiple connections in Chicago. And I don't know what happens to the recruiting afterwards on that. And Peggy can tell you that sometimes the records are really frustrating because, there are places where you can't find what you need. So why didn't somebody save that? So Peggy put in lots of plugs for the archives. I'm going to put in one plug for the historians here. If you are in a position where you have any kinds of records, don't throw them out. Give them to Peggy if they're relevant to this place so that, 30 years from now, somebody like me can come find something and say, yeah, that's what they were thinking about. Or, better yet, your version of history will win, right? Because you're the only one who's got any records. And everybody else might have had a different interpretation, but too bad, we don't have any records, so the historian will do it their way. Okay, long answer to one question. What else?
I would maybe just add that, there was a lot of years there where the enrollment was increasing by leaps and bounds to the point where we had to keep building more housing, dorms for students to live in. And maybe that was one reason why they weren't looking so much at trying to diversify the student population. And then when it got to the point where the enrollment was maybe facing the realities of the demographics and the changing culture of the country and the fact that the college student, high school student population was more diverse, that it was time for us to start attracting a more diverse population as well.
We certainly will come back around to that. I would also, I'm supposed to do the national thing here. I would also say that looking at that 1980 number, you need to understand that most of the 70s we were, St. John's, St. Ben's, and the rest of the nation were consumed with our economic disaster. Inflation was amazing. Incomes were going down. Unemployment was going up. The thought of spending money on something frivolous like recruiting racial minorities probably wasn't on the agenda. We're also not very interested in civil rights nationally during that period. And by the time you get Reagan in 1980, that's simply off the agenda. So there's not that kind of encouragement anymore to do that. Now, I don't know whether that plays here or not. I don't know. I haven't done enough to answer that. What else?
Well, I think we're,
Peggy, you've got one in the back.
I'm curious if you have any data on Black faculty at the campuses, and how that plays a role in attracting Black students.
I think that's probably been an even bigger struggle than attracting students of diversity, is trying to diversify the faculty over the years. They've had, of course, some successes, but back in 68, I mentioned Father Aiden as being one of the few Black people. He was the dean of students. I think Norman James, who joined the psychology department, was the first Black faculty member who wasn't in the monastery like Father Aiden was. And for quite a few years, Bill, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was the only one for quite a few years before we got somebody else. There was a few other monks or priests who were here, but Norman was the only lay faculty member who was Black for quite a while.
He comes in 74. So, and we lived together in what was at that point termed the ghetto in St. Joe, on a cul-de-sac in St. Joe by the 8 plexes. There were our Protestant family, another Protestant family, and Norman James, and all the rest of St. Joe was Catholic. So it was like, okay.
It's also difficult, even with the records in the archives, to count things. I know Ken made a worthwhile attempt at it, but they didn't count the Black, the people who weren't white. They didn't ask for that statistic. They didn't have a box to check off to say if you were white or Hispanic or another color or Black, that they do now. It just wasn't a question that was asked. So even if there were people here, they didn't distinguish. In some regards, I think they would have considered that a way to avoid being accused of discrimination, asking people their race. They came here and you weren't supposed to care what race they were. So I don't have those kinds of numbers in the archives very often because the question wasn't asked. So there was Ken going through the old student directories, which had pictures in those days, trying to count how many Blacks there were by how they looked. And we all know that that isn't a realistic way to identify people of color either. But that was one of the few ways we had at our disposal because of the
About the
lack
only
of-
way we had at our disposal. So, there's no self-identified piece in this. And to let us off the hook a little bit here, I mean, Peggy's point is wonderful, but the U.S. Census Bureau until 1972 categorized as they had whites and then they had Blacks and others. So if you were Hispanic, Asian, Native American, you were all in that Blacks and others together. So it's binary. It's whites and everybody else until 1972. People simply didn't look and pay attention to those things.
And we couldn't necessarily go by the country they came from either. For example, even the Bahamians, some of the Bahamians who came here
White, yeah.
were white or certainly looked white. So how are you supposed to know? Anyway, any other questions? We're out of time, unfortunately.
Oh, we need to get the screen back up, though, for Karen. I'm sorry, I screwed that up.
Do you still have the clicker?
I have it. Do I have the clicker? We can go down to the end here. Can we get the...
Let me get it, shut it down.
We have one more piece here, sort of an associated piece, I guess. And Oh, Karen, I'm sorry, after we did all of that? Oh, okay. There we go. Okay, now we can do it. Get out of the way.
We want to thank all of you for staying late on a Friday after a long day, and thank, on behalf of the MLK Faculty Teach-In Planning Group, I want to thank all the professors, all the faculty and staff who contributed to this event. I also want to make a special thank you to Brandon Woodard, who worked with us on this. And last year, he organized the Faculty Teach-In. This year, I had a big hand, and I've got to really thank him for what he did last year, because now I know more about what he did last year. We want to send you off with a performance of a piece of music called Meditation on the Blessings of Peace. It began as a concept to give voice to the blessings of peace, strength, and mercy in a time of great discord, war, and calamity. I was inspired by the St. John's Bible Project image of the Beatitudes that you see here, and thanks to Tim Turnus for allowing us to show that to you while we're singing. The image fractures and unites words and colors as a stained glass window communicates a united image through fragments activated by light. So I offer this to you with the singers behind me, thanks to them too, urging us all to keep peace in mind, thought, and prayer so that it might be the breath within our actions.
And so here I am talking with you. I want you to find the poor here, right in your own home first, and begin love there.
For this is the kingdom of heaven.
Be that good news to your own people. Mother Teresa, 1979.
Blessed are those who mourn.
In every area of human creativity, indifference is the enemy.
For they shall be comforted.
Indifference of evil is worse than evil, because it is also sterile. Elie Wiesel, 1986.
For they
pray for us all, oppressor and friend, but together we succeed in building a better world through human understanding and love.
Blessed are the meek, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
And that in doing so we may reduce the pain and suffering of all sentient beings. The Dalai Lama, 1989.
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied.
For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. Prayer read by the Dalai Lama. One day our grandchildren will go to museums to see what poverty was like. Muhammad Yunus, 2006.
For they shall obtain mercy.
We will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It is not enough to say we must not wage war.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but on the positive affirmation of peace. We must see that peace represents a sweeter music, a cosmic melody that is far superior to the discords of war. Martin Luther King Jr., 1964.
Blessed are